Hello, and welcome to the lectures for Chapter 12 and 13. In this particular lecture series, guys, we're going to go ahead and just smush 12 and 13 together and kind of break them down into two major groups here. So we're going to begin with Crisis, the 100 Years' War, and Religious Schism. And then the second part of the lecture will be the Black Death and the Renaissance. Now, this is just going to be recorded as one long continuous recording, so it's going to be a little bit longer than your usual. And this will take place of both a lecture and allow you to kind of get your streaming lecture in for this week as well. Do keep in mind that you have a discussion post for this lecture. If you are in my military course, you have a discussion for this lecture, so you're going to want to use some of the material that you find here and in your textbook to help you with that. All right, so when we left off in chapter 10 and 11, we're seeing some interesting phenomenon develop, right? We started to see the flowering of the Middle Ages. We got into the High Middle Ages. This is a time period when we went away from the Romanesque style of protection and fortification, and we started seeing cathedrals pop up all over Northern Europe. Cathedrals that then become learning institutions and universities. And this is going to be very, very, very important to all of the events in these next two chapters, because this flowering of the Middle Ages, this changeover in style, the kinds of patron systems that we saw developing for that is going to be a big part of the backbone of the humanist movement. But also we're going to see some other things that developed in the last couple of chapters. The creation of regional identities, especially in northwestern Europe, especially places where we had the Frank invasion, where we had the Goths, we had the Bulgars, the Alvars, etc. In the south. But we see in all of these locations regional secular rulers become more prominent and they become more powerful, and people really start to identify themselves more in terms of the places they're in. We're going to see some interesting things develop here that are going to kind of further cement concepts of the nation state. And that's really going to lead us into chapter 14 and 15 when we really start to see the nation state begin to develop. And when you guys get to your classroom flip, this is really when you're going to see this nation-state concept take hold under the guise of absolutism and constitutional monarchies. Now, additionally, some other things that we saw in the last chapter that are going to be very important for this chapter is that rise of Islam, especially with the Golden Age of Islam, where we saw a whole heck of a lot of Greco-Roman texts preserved and translated in the Islamicate, in all of those various competing caliphates that we had, the Fatimid, the Umayyad, and the Abbasid, largely. We're also going to see the Mughal develop in India, but that's not really going to concern us here too terribly much, although by the time you get into your next class, it will. Now, additionally, we saw the Golden Horde bring in some very useful and necessary devices. The big useful thing that the Golden Horde brought with them was the horseshoe, right? And the stirrup. These two items together are going to be very important for this chapter as well, because they're going to make the circumstances for all those knights that we saw in the Crusades, right? The heavier armor, heavier lances, bigger swords. You can carry these if you have a stirrup. And in the fields, the triennial system combined with that horseshoe allow for oxen to plow the fields in a more timely and efficient manner. So we're going to see all of that have some effects, because really by the time we got to the end of last chapter, the world was starting to look pretty awesome. It was starting to look kind of like what we see here. This is part of a multi-panel set by Hieronymus Bosch called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And this piece begins in a world that would be familiar to Hieronymus Bosch from his standpoint. It would be the world of the 12th century and just before we really hit the 13th century. This is a time when our population just soars because the triennial system allowed for so much more food production. We saw our populations rise in the last chapter. We see that people are doing really well in trade. All of that commercial quickening that we talked about in the last two chapters, right? The creation of the commune, especially in Italy. That's a big one. And those modern banking systems, right? That's another thing that we discussed. That commercial quickening allows for a vibrancy in trade, a rise in mercantile culture. It means that people are going to start leaving and or expanding on what had been very enclosed village life, you know, where you could be born in a village and you would die in a village and never see anything else for the rest of your life. This has started to kind of fade into the background. We saw the vassalage system loosen up in certain areas, especially in the Frankish kingdoms, right? And with the loosening of that vassalage system, we saw people who have social mobility and physical mobility in a way that they haven't before. So we're going to see a world that kind of feels magical to people. It really, really does. It feels like the world is everyone's oyster. Unfortunately, though, this period of verdancy and vibrancy in culture is going to get a really, really big godsmack in the form of a number of crises. The first of that being the Little Ice Age, right? In the 1250s, we have a severe cold snap. Likely, this severe cold snap was a result of another tectonic event. We've kind of been discussing Annals history and the way certain geological and natural disaster events can in fact affect, as a push-pull factor, historical events and attitudes and perspectives. And one thing that we definitely see here is that with likely the explosion of a number of major basalt flow volcanoes in Siberia, there was a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere, as happens with a really, really high pressure volcanic explosion, because it's kind of like having a number of nuclear bombs all in the same place. But what that does is it releases a whole lot of ash, it releases a lot of carbon, and it tends to have a lot of negative effects in the world around it. So we saw likely a whole number of tectonic events, and we do have records of some of these, especially from northern China, from the administrative unit of the Golden Horde, that it's rather likely that these events caused a short warming, which we saw as being beneficial to culture when crops were really becoming very productive and populations were soaring. That brief warm weather was great, but warm weather is always followed by cold weather. It's just the way a carbon-based atmosphere works. And we see that in 1250 we see a massive change in temperature that affects the north even more than it does the south. I would say the south, there's regions in the south that were barely even touched by this change, like in parts of Africa, that fared much better under the Little Ice Age than parts of Europe, where it had already been a bit of a struggle to farm, and only that heavy plow and the triennial system had really allowed them to get the kind of consistent yields that they needed in the terrain that they had. Unfortunately, though, that's going to be very difficult to maintain with these colder weather patterns. Additionally, the rise of the wool industry in Northern Europe and the cottage industries around that were part of our commercial quickening, right? All of those are going to be negatively affected by this cold snap. And what we will see is the Great Famine come out of this. From 1315 to 1322, we have massive crop failures, Lots of extreme weather events, most specifically flooding. That's what happens when you have lots of crop failures, when you have not enough coverage in terms of plant life. You're going to get more floods, especially in the north where we know that there were all those river systems. The river systems people had been using during the time when our roads became unsafe in chapter 8 through about chapter 9. Now, all of this tumultuousness causes inflation, and also we're going to see a lot of starvation and people migrating, because those looser vassalage systems meant that they didn't have to stay on a farm that wasn't working. But we're also going to see here when we get to the second part of the lecture the way that the Black Death also influenced this, because we're going to see a massive die-off in population. We go from overpopulation in many areas to absolute zero growth, which is almost unheard of historically. It cannot really be said enough that that really about the mid-12th to about the mid-14th century were really a unique historical time period. We very rarely have seen so much death and destruction in such a short period of time. And the psychological effects that this is going to have on people, we're going to see all of the many ways that people psychologically process these major disasters. But not everybody did process these major disasters very well, and the people who took the brunt of crises were then, as they are always, the very, very poor. And so you're going to see that the peasants are going to suffer much more than their noble masters. During the Black Death, rich people were able to leave the city and go into the countryside and get away from the disease. Rich people were able to assure that they had some place to live even during the ravages of the 100 Years' War, which were intense, especially in Northern Europe, especially in the Germanic-speaking countries, in that Deutschland, right? That non-Germany, it's not Germany yet, it's multiple kind of princely states all speaking German. But they suffered probably more from the effects of the 100 Years' War than most anybody else. So too did northern France. And it's there that we're going to see a number of peasant revolts that go all the way from that northern corridor all the way down into the south of France, into Switzerland, over into Poland, and even into the Caucasus Mountains in some cases. It's going to be a lot of tumultuousness in the next few years. And that's why we see Hieronymus Bosch's multi-panel work, The Garden of Earthly Delights, end like this. The cities are going to become dangerous places, places of death and disease, because of the filthiness of the city, the unplanned nature of the city that we discussed. When these cities grew during the commercial quickening, people didn't really plan for it the way we saw Augustus Octavian plan Rome out when he rebuilt it from the ashes during his reign. We're going to see people dying. We're going to see barren fields. Many, many places will be burned to the ground because, as we will discuss here very soon, the 100 Years' War is one of the first modern warfare events. And there's a number of reasons why we say that. But the biggest one is really that people applied modern warfare techniques, and one of those was scorched earth. The burning of villages and farmland and the countryside by troops, largely mercenary soldiers moving from location to location, was really very devastating to people. And you can see this reflected in this incredibly kind of visceral, shocking image following such a peaceful and lovely image from the first panel. But really, it all began innocently enough, pun definitely intended, with a whole number of tensions, that have been really on the rise over the past few chapters. Some of these tensions have gone all the way back to the 9th and 10th century, and they've been kind of building. We discussed in the last 2 chapters the way that the papal monarchy had re-envisioned the idea of power in the church. They had been nailing down ideas of sexuality in the clergy by demanding that clergy not marry. We know that Gregory the Great put out a series of papal bulls, and we're going to see that papal monarchy come up against some secular powers. We already saw a little bit of that, right, with the spanking of good old Henry. We saw the church come up against secular authority, and in that case they won. However, secular authorities have been gaining power and prestige, most especially because of mercantilism. So the more that the princely states and the more secular authority begins to push back at the church, the more the church is going to dig its heels in and present itself as the ultimate authority and power. I mean, they, after all, had been anointing emperors and rulers. Their direct connection to the Holy Roman Empire, all of this had really given them a certain degree of authority. And with the Fourth Lateran Council held in 1215, we see the most specific and direct expression of this authority. There's probably no more important event in the history of Catholicism than the Fourth Lateran Council. This was a time when they were really promoting the will of papal law, and they were really making more inroads into the private sphere, right? That private space. Instead of just kind of being involved in the general health and welfare of the poor, instead of just being involved in telling people how to understand and interpret the textual canon, we see that they start to really nail down a concept of sacraments. And we already saw a certain obsession in sacraments with the papal monarchy, and we see this even further expressed in the Fourth Lateran Council, where we actually have the church say we will be involved directly in marriage. And we talked a little bit about why that's odd, because marriage rituals in many of the northern kingdoms were a little bit odd, and they were very much private family affairs. They were about secular authority. They're for rich people. Getting married was something that you did to secure an alliance, as we saw with Henry and Eleanor of Aquitaine, poor Eleanor. But this is about alliance. It's about securing power and authority. For the poor, marriage wasn't really a necessity. It would be a small family affair with your large kinship group, usually in a manse or large property. We talked about the binding ritual, right, where you would have the young couple with the wooden board between them, tucked in with the blanket, and supposedly they're not meant to touch each other, but just get to know each other and see if it works. In all reality, much of the time they did indeed consummate at that moment and see if everything worked. And if it didn't, they moved on. But unfortunately, all of the disruption that we see caused by war, by famine, and by disease is going to mean that a lot of young men, especially, and sometimes even women, will leave behind their family, including children, to go and forge their fortune in the city. And so you see a lot of people who are kind of left behind, like Kirk Cameron, right? And this is a bit of a problem. So the church steps in. We also see secular authorities actually step in more with the idea of the marriage of the poorer classes, which had not really been a concern for anybody. This was something kept between the family. But now it's defined as a sacrament. So too is communion and Mass. Mass was something that maybe you went to once a year. Christmas, Easter, one of the big holidays, you'd go to Mass. But as we noted, the world's been kind of expanding. We're seeing more churches and cathedrals happening. We're seeing that people are able to go and sit for large Masses in a way that they couldn't before. So this gets nailed down as a sacrament. And it should be noted that Innocent III, the Pope who led this and called this Lateran Council, was really very well beloved, especially by Italians, as we see expressed here in this Giotti painting, one of the transitional artists that lead us into the Renaissance. However, as we discussed before, there had been some tension rising between the Christian world, especially in the wake of the Crusades, and the Jewish world. We saw the way that Jewish people were used by secular and religious authority as people put into profession bans, limited in their access to various careers and professions. And those professions that they were involved in, many of them had to do with money. Money that, of course, the church saw as kind of a filthy thing that created sin in people. It was, we've talked about this, the kind of naughtiness of money now starts to become a thing, especially with the rise of mercantile culture. Jewish folks were used to collect debts, and then many of them were then executed by rulers that owed debts. This was all done, of course, in the name of a number of anti-Semitic notions that came out. The Fourth Lateran Council nailed this down even further by requiring that there be some kind of badge defining Jewish people as Jewish, so we could see upon meeting them that they were Jewish. And we see that here with the yellow circle. Yes, I'm sure many of you are familiar with World War II and the badge that Jewish people had to wear, the Star of David, to identify themselves as Jewish to the people of the world. We see this occur first with the Fourth Lateran Council, but that's not the only thing that was happening. It wasn't just the church that was creating this visible Judaism that people could fear and malign. It was also secular authorities and regional authorities, as we see here with the clothing of Jewish people that shows what they were allowed to wear. Certain colors couldn't be worn. Certain hat types were very popular, like the hat that you see that has a little pointed ball on the top. Something to keep in mind is that when we see that picture of Marco Polo here for the next part of our lecture, we will see one of the people in that picture dressed as a Jewish person of that time, and we will see that identified by these different clothing types allowed for Jewish people to wear. And this is really from the 12th century to the 14th century. Some of the ones on the bottom panel on the far left are further along. They're in the 15th and 16th century in the Ottoman world. However, all the rest of this we see is Northern Europe and Italy. The top panel is Italy and the Mediterranean. We see the south of France there in the center. And in the center panel, we see people from Northern Europe and Germania and in the Norman world and in England. Now, another thing that became very popular at this time period that spelled disaster for many Jewish people was this concept of blood libel. Because, I mean, we talked about this before. When do we see persecution of Jewish people? We often see it at times of crisis. The idea being the world has gone mad and we must have somebody to blame for it. One thing that pops up a lot during the 100 Years' War and the Black Death is that this is all some kind of divine punishment for being too worldly and being too sinful. So then people look around at the world around them and see what around them is sinful that they can attack. This is how the Reform movement really begins. This is how humanism starts to challenge ideas from the church. This is how we see a number of people challenging even secular authorities through peasant revolts. And we see this as well with anti-Semitism and the rise of blood libel. This idea that Jewish people sacrificed children, especially Christian children. That was the common story. Christian children would be sacrificed in some elaborate Passover ceremony because of a particularly bad translation of old Judaic texts talking about the ritual of Passover, where you put the lamb's blood outside of the door to keep, the plague from taking your son, etc., etc. We all know that story. Now, unfortunately, one thing that had been happening during this time period is the rise of paper culture, as we discussed in the last couple of chapters, that the Arab world had introduced paper. And this was slowly starting to take hold. Now, we don't yet have the printing press. It's not going to be until 1453 in chapter 14 and 15 that we see the printing press. But we do have paper and we do have wood block. And we see that here because this is actually a pamphlet that would have been distributed as propaganda. We see the rise of propaganda at this time period because of paper culture, because of these woodcuts that became popular at the time, and because that mercantile class made it possible for there to be people who could sit around printing and being paid for it as part of a cottage industry. Unfortunately, this was very, very disastrous for the Jewish people of Europe, as we see here, because in our last chapter we talked about the multiple Jewish pogroms, the execution of Jewish people as heretics, largely because of that crusade fervor. And now we see that taken even further with a number of major expulsions. We see part of that being the Reconquisto in Spain, right? When that Visigothic culture attached to ideas of blood purity attached to how Christian you and your family lineage was. If you were Jewish or if you were Muslim, you were meant to be kicked out. Of course, we do know to this day that there was a number of crypto-Muslims and Jews, hidden Muslims and Jews that continued to be Muslims and Jews, but presented an outward appearance of Christianity and said that they were Christian to other people so they would not be expelled. They said that they converted. And in fact, the Inquisition is going to be part of this kind of steeped up hereticizing of Jewish people that's going to combine with expulsions to make a very difficult condition for many Jewish people. And you'll see many of them settle in the Muslim world, especially under the Ottoman Empire. We're going to also see a number of them go to Poland, where they're allowed to work in any number of professions without really any issue. And in fact, they're going to be the backbone of a major Polish Renaissance that we see flourishing in the 14th through 15th century. And just as propaganda had spelled disaster for the Jewish people of Europe, we saw propaganda really coming to the fore with this tension that's been rising between the church and secular authority. Because the problem with having the power to propagandize is that both sides of this religious debate are really going to get into a head-on-head conflict, and it's going to exacerbate the conditions of a growing tension between the Eastern and the Western Church. The Eastern Greek Orthodox Church that's come out of the Byzantine Empire and the Carolingian Renaissance, and the Western Church, the Catholic Church, which has really been reigned over by a pope instead of a patriarch. Now, add to this mix secular authorities, because we already saw with the Crusades the way that secular and religious authorities had become pretty incestuous in their designs and in their procedures, especially with the Crusades becoming really more of a trade war. We saw the rise of the commune system really create in Italy conditions favorable for this in places like Milan and Venice, and we're going to see the rise of Genoa as well. And all of this kind of, in Frederick of Barbarossa, we know, was, he cemented ties to Sicily by marriage and was able to kind of consolidate his rulership of the Holy Roman Empire. And we're going to see that also coming to play here with the tensions that arise most specifically between Frederick II and Innocent III. Now, Frederick II was son of a Sicilian heiress and Frederick Barbarossa, right, who we talked about in the last chapter. And they're really fighting. There's many princes in Germany after Frederick Barbarossa dies, fighting over the Holy Roman Empire title, because when Barbarossa dies, his son is only 3 years old. So Frederick II is only 3 when he becomes king, and in fact, when this all began, Otto, who was a Habsburg, sought to become the emperor until the king could reach maturity. And he promised Innocent III that he would not invade Italy if he was given the anointed status of emperor. This big, powerful thing that the church did that secured secular authority was anointing emperors, right? This was something that went all the way back to Charlemagne. But Otto kind of double deals him a little bit because he invades Sicily. Sicily, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. This is very important. We continue to return to the fact that Sicily is the breadbasket of all of the Mediterranean. So invading Sicily is a pretty big deal. So the Pope excommunicates Otto and crowns Frederick II emperor in 1212. Now, when he anoints Frederick, he anoints a child who is being controlled largely by a number of the princes in that power conglomerate of the German-speaking world, Deutschland, right? The Pope at the same time is really seeking to expand his papal states, but the Holy Roman Empire has quite a lot of land grants to some of the areas that they seek to expand into. And we're going to see this kind of, all of the tensions that all of these events create are going to kind of come to a head when we see a couple of big things happen that establish secular authority over religious authority. And the first of these is the constitutions of Melfi in 1231, which really is about laws that govern the standard procedure for our basic government, yes, but it also promotes the idea of royal authority over this religious authority, that royal authority reigns supreme. And then in 1232, a further kind of nail in the coffin happens for the church in the form of the statute in favor of the princess, which promotes specifically independent princely states as power units. And Frederick II, when he comes to his primacy, is anything but supportive of the Pope, because the Pope was calling for basically the idea of being the person who appoints all of the successors, right? We're the ones who give you your authority via anointing. But with the Council of Lyons in 1245, the Pope really comes forward and calls his council and says, okay, I'm Innocent the Third. Sorry, it's not Innocent the Third. The Pope calls a council and he appoints himself as basically like a vassal lord. I give you anointingship, and that's what creates your power. Now, this all really results in the election of Rudolph, which begins Habsburg power in the Holy Roman Empire, especially in the Germanic world. And we're going to kind of return to this as a concept a little bit more down the line. Something to keep in mind, though, is that parliaments are forming in many areas in the form of parliaments as representative governments in the Norman world under Louis IX, who himself believed that papal authority should be in harmony with secular authority, that they should rule side by side. But this form of representative government is reflected also in England with the Parliament and with the Magna Carta that's established, that we talked about a little bit in last chapter. We also see the Cortes form in Spain under Alfonso IX and Alfonso X, which just basically adds to a lot of the parliamentary enforcement of law, more representative governments that work in tandem with powerful people. So we have the English Parliament, we have the Cortes in Spain, we have the Parliament in France, and all of these are kind of starting to express themselves more. And all of this ends up leading the papacy to kind of come to a point of tension with a lot of these secular rulers. And we see this no more than when we see a kind of battle after the Council of Lyons over rulership, and we start to see the lines form that will actually express a bigger concern happening at this time, the 100 Years' War, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But what ends up basically happening is that all of this is going to lead to a major series of kind of tense events that exemplify the rising tension between secular and religious authority. We already talked about Henry II and Thomas Becket, how he kind of hired a bunch of thugs, likely, to kill off Thomas Becket for not supporting Henry II's stance against the Pope. And whether or not Henry had anything to do with it, he still was publicly admonished by the Pope and accepted this. So this was a secular loss. But here in the late 1200s and the early 1300s, we see that the secular side really wins. The constitutions of Melfi, the statute of princely authority really in the north is met with more in the south and in the French world, most especially with Philip the Fair, who is involved in something cutely enough called the Philip Affair, where Philip II, Edward I, and Pope Boniface all kind of wage a propagandistic war of words and of deeds against each other, because both England and France, and well, really many countries, are running out of the kinds of tax money they need to support the 100 Years' War. So the idea becomes, hey, let's go ahead and tax the clergy. And in fact, that's exactly what you see both Philip and Edward doing. They propose that they're going to tax the clergy. Pope Boniface is like, you can't do that. That's not acceptable. That's not what we do in the Christian world. And of course it isn't what has been done up until this point. And this battle becomes so fierce that France and England both propose that they're going to close down their borders and not allow passage of people through, which would be really deleterious. Closed borders are financially very deleterious. They're a financial burden because they slow down trade, communication, etc. So when the Pope has basically said, you know, your clergy are going to have to not be able to travel. They're going to be stuck where they are. They aren't going to be able to go to councils and to concourts and all of that good stuff that the papacy has been kind of building more and more in order to support its authority. They're not going to be able to do that because they're going to be stuck inside of closed borders. So Boniface backs down in 1297. But then again in 1301 we have a major unfortunate event. Basically, one particular clergyman, Bernard Sausset, who is the Bishop of Palmyre, another one of these kinds of power centers where he has quite a lot of authority. He has for some time been waging his propaganda campaign. He's part of the propaganda campaign of the church. So the church releases papal bulls, they release pamphlets saying this is what church authority should be. This is, these horrible secular rulers who are doing sinful things and they should be excommunicated. Bernard Sausset is one of the people who is involved in this propaganda campaign, but he is tried and arrested for treason. Indeed, for treason. And interestingly enough, in a lot of that propaganda stuff, he was compared to an owl, the bird that makes the hooting noise. Yes, indeed. And apparently that was a really big burn back in 1301 to be compared to an owl, because it was in all of these different pamphlets. Just why that's a burn, who even knows? It's kind of ridiculous, but it was back then. And when Bernard Sausset is arrested for treason, the popes kind of start their own war of propaganda, most especially through the form of councils and a papal bull, in papal bulls. And one of the most kind of fiery of those would be the Unum Sanctum of 1302, which basically just goes about talking about how the church has ultimate authority, that if religion is not the central authority and all else does not bow beneath it, that we are living in a sinful world and will all be punished, etc., etc., etc. Now, the French aren't particularly happy with the Unum Sanctum, which almost in a sense kind of almost asks Christian people to assassinate French rulers if they don't fall into line. It kind of passive aggressively, microaggressively, in a kind of popular pretty girl way, makes that known. The French are not happy with this at all. And in fact, Philip orders a number of French agents to invade Boniface's palace and capture him by force. Indeed, the Pope himself, Boniface, is kidnapped by French agents. And although this was an interesting plan, people weren't particularly on board for that amount of extremism. And in fact, the French authorities or the French hitmen who he hired, those thugs, did not make it out in Anagni in Italy. The people of Italy basically rise up and take these men into custody and return the Pope to his palace. But this is really a shocking, shocking event. The fact that a secular ruler would kidnap the Pope or attempt to kidnap the Pope for whatever means he might have is really problematic. And the only reason that this was able to happen is because there's been a bit of a civil war because of those trade wars and the rise of the signori, right, in the Italian peninsula, where we saw great men become really powerful movers and shakers in regional trade wars. But these great men were pretty gangster, just like the clans had been that we discussed in Paul Bishop's article about the Roman Empire when we talked about the the rise of the clans and the great families. We see this again with the great family names being these kinds of clans who, and there's one great man that kind of rules over that entire family. But unfortunately, these great men were fighting with each other quite a lot in the Italian peninsula. And when you add to it this shocking kidnapping of a pope, what we see is it drives the papacy out of Rome. And in fact, for the years of 1309 through 1378, the Papal States moved from Rome to Avignon in France, in modern-day France. Now, this is a huge, huge blow to the Christian world. We recall that for a short time, the popes were driven out of Rome during the Lombard invasion, but they were allowed to return, and then they really commenced and gained power thereafter. So really throughout history, the idea had been that the Pope lives in Rome, that this is very much a Roman tradition. However, being driven out of Rome meant a lot of people just thought, well, what is happening with our papacy? And though it should be said that the rise of administrative learning in France meant a much more efficient administrative system in the church, especially in the wake of the Inquisitions and some of the offshoots that had produced. We do see a more efficient system, but for lots of people, the idea here was that Avignon was a place of vice. It was in France, which was kind of already establishing a reputation for being the kind of naughty, decadent culture of the West, right? They were the ones that danced lots and had lascivious sexual encounters, and they wore lascivious clothing. They showed their various parts in ways that weren't acceptable, and this whole idea of the kind of lascivious French people really is already there at this time. And we can see this expressed in one painter, Brugger, from the Northern Renaissance. He views this papacy the way that we see Eugen Weber refer to it in his Western tradition lectures, as the Babylonian captivity. Indeed, the Babylonian captivity. And we see that reflected here with this kind of view of the papacy as this like modern day Babel, this modern day Babylon, right? This was a really significantly psychologically traumatizing event for people in the Middle Ages, and it all really came to a head in 1348 because the Avignon papacy was highly, highly unpopular in the Catholic world. Now, there's a lot of rumors which were propagated by, again, propaganda distributed through these new paper means, right? Through woodcuts. And when the printing press happens, propaganda is going to become the name of the game all the time. But we already start to see this happen as early as the Great Schism and the 100 Years' War. Now, this unpopularity of the Avignon papacy, the Babylonian captivity, drives a return of the Papal States to Rome in 1370 with Gregory XI. However, when Gregory XI dies, because there's roughly about 7 popes that happened during the Avignon papacy, and Gregory is the last. When he returns, he is a Frenchman. And everybody is calling for the next pope to be Italian, right? But then there's a number of people in other areas who go, no, it should be a Frenchman because they're the ones who have the authority and they've been there for the past few years. So we're going to see that in the papal election, we're going to get 2 popes voted for. We're going to have Urban VI, who is the Roman choice. He is that Roman pope. And then we have Clement VII, who is the French pope, right? And we start to see that different secular rulers choose different popes because of political reasons largely associated with the 100 Years' War and the way that that divided kind of various nations into allies, much the same way that we saw with people falling on one side or another in the debate of the Philip affair, when we see people falling on one side or another for the trade wars. Much of this is just reflecting a larger series of alliances that have been forming over a number of kind of hostile international breakdowns of negotiation that turn into warfare and bloodshed. So we see Europe kind of split about who supports which pope. We have Clement having support in France, of course, in Burgundy, in Scotland, and in Castile. Urban, that Roman pope, has the support of England, who just does this to stick a thumb out at good old France, because that's the people that they're actively at war with. We have the Holy Roman Emperor, again, some of those wars that happened between various authorities during the Philip affair. We have Poland and Hungary also supporting Urban. Now, Portugal was the smart cat of the whole group. And they switched sides and allegiances 4 times during the entire affair. They were our favorite switch hitter, because they just, they chose the winning side. Whoever appeared to be winning were the people that they supported. So now we have 2 popes, right? And we kind of get into our new excommunication battle royale, where we have Urban the Sixth saying, "I excommunicate you, Clement the Seventh," and then Clement the Seventh says, "No, no, no, I excommunicate you." Now, both of these popes have issues calling councils, because only a pope is allowed to call a council. The Council of Lyons had to be called by a pope, right? So here's the problem. What if you've got 2 popes and nobody can agree on which one is the right one, the just one, the one that should be there? What do you do? And in fact, we start to see people struggle with this very idea. And we have the consular movement rise out of this. The consular movement was a bunch of people within the upper echelons in the church saying, okay, we cannot count on the Pope to call a council. We should be able to call a council at times of crises like this one, which is exactly what they do. And they elect their own Pope, Martin V, who is kind of the middleman. He's not one thing, he's not another. He seems to be the fair choice that won't make one side angry or the other. But of course, neither side supports this new pope. So now, for a short period of time, we have 3 popes. And it should be noted that even after Urban and Clement died, they chose successors for them that continued the schism. So both Urban and Clement are now continuing on this tradition of schism via their successors, which is exactly what happens. And it takes some time for this all to be resolved. But by the end of this massive battle, people really have a different view of the church. The fact that there's such a breakdown of order, the move of the church away from Rome, and then the many, many years long struggle over who was the Pope. All of this coming as it did during the Black Death and during the 100 Years' War, during a time of the Little Ice Age when people were already in crisis, during a time of famine. It all kind of makes people feel like the world is coming to an end. And in fact, that the church has no power to save anyone from this devastation and destruction, because they are themselves being destroyed internally, which is what we see expressed here with images of the popes in hell. Yes, indeed, popes in hell, something that we'll see in writing at this time period, as well as in paintings. Like the Decameron, for example, had popes living in hell. This was a time of massive crisis and of breakdown, and nowhere is this more true than, uh, well, in the Black Death, I would say it's as true, but the 100 Years' War is the other big determining factor in the crisis of this age. And really what this comes down to is it's a long-term struggle for land. And it is the culmination of years of tension formed when William the Conqueror, as a Norman invader, marched into the Anglo-Saxon world and killed off roughly 1/3 of the power structure there. People do not forget this. It might also be added that trade and commercial quickening had established certain areas in northern France that had been incredibly contentious between the English and the French as who owned what. Those areas became major producers for wool in the wool cottage industry, and they were attached to this large kind of culture of mercantilism revolving around wool. So what we're going to see is a struggle for land really kind of expand outward into a massive culmination of all these things that we were talking about, these alliances that people are making. Some of them have to do with these religious struggles. Some of them have to do with trade struggles. Some of them have to do with tensions between cultures because of the Norman invasion. And all of these kind of come to a head when King Philip VI annexes Guyenne in 1337. He basically says, it's that whole thing that Eddie Izzard says in his stand-up comedy routine, this is the English way. You're just going to go out and you're going to put a flag in it. Now it's mine then, yeah? Now it's mine. I put a flag in it. And that's basically what annexing is. It's just you just say this is mine now, and you're just going to have to live with it, whoever was there before. And Edward of England doesn't really agree with this annexation, obviously. And so he declares war in 1337, and thus begins one of the longest running wars in the ancient classical world. That when we look at the pre-modern world, it's very rare that we see a war of this size. And in fact, Froissart argued at the time that this was the end of chivalry, the knight tradition that we had seen in the Crusades and in the world of the High Middle Ages. And it is replaced by this new, more modern warfare, that this old way of doing war is replaced by a new way. And we'll talk about some of the ways that this is modern warfare. One of the ways that this was very much a modern warfare situation is that we see the first concept of this kind of idea of world war, a war that involves multiple nations or government entities in alliance with each other to fight a battle on multiple stages in various locations. And in fact, we see that here. We see Germany, Switzerland, Italy, the Netherlands, especially Germany, guys, especially Germany. And even in parts of Africa, the 100 Years' War is waged. We also see that knights are replaced by and large by mercenary armies. And we discussed that a little bit before with, the ravage of the countryside largely forming out of the fact that there's all these mercenary armies being hired to go out and wage warfare because so many people died. So many people died in the Black Death, in the famines. Even rich people died. So many people died or left Europe to go to the Crusader states and the Crusades. There just wasn't enough people to wage this war if you didn't go to mercenary soldiers, which people did. And we also saw that there was a number of new tools of warfare that had come via innovation and via cultural exposure to the Golden Horde, the Mongols, to the Ottoman Empire, the new Islamic rulership that comes out of Turkey in the wake of the Seljuk invasion. So we see archery really develop more. And this is really going to mean the difference between the first and the second stage of war, because this war has two major phases. The first is when we see really the English winning, and the second is when we see the French winning. A big reason why they won was because of the tools of warfare that they used. One other major development and innovation we saw was the development of gunpowder. Now, this isn't going to be used in actual physical guns. It's going to be used in cannons. But cannons are going to be a huge siege breaker. This had kind of been the thing before, right? Siege warfare is always going to be a big part of what we talk about when we talk about large-scale wars. Siege warfare is always going to be a part of it. And breaking sieges is really what any side wants to do. We're going to see the development of lots and lots of foot soldiers, and we haven't seen anything like this since the Peloponnesian War during certain phases of the Roman Empire. And it's going to be even a larger scale than we saw at that time. It's going to involve far more separate entities. We're going to see alliances form with these religious debates, with the Great Schism, with the trade wars that are happening in the Mediterranean. All those are going to come together with the alliances forged in this war to create a kind of very divided European world. But one thing to keep in mind as well is that this war was devastating, especially for Northern Europe, especially the Germanic world and Northern France, where the devastation was the most concrete, where so many fields and farms were burned down, where so many people were put to the sword as mercenary armies raged through the countryside. And along with this kind of belief that people are living in a world that is turned from God, reflected in the Great Schism, with the Black Death, with famine, all of these are going to come to a head to create a lot of peasant revolts and a lot of civil disorder. And really, for the 100 Years' War, no battle is kind of more important to understanding a new kind of idea that's coming out of this war, the idea of the nation state. These parliamentary governments and representative governments are going to come together during this war with ideas of self, the way that we identify ourselves as French, as English. These are going to come together, and we're going to see an emerging idea of nation state that's really going to lead us into, after a period of reformation that is long overdue, and some colonialism, that's going to lead us in to absolutism and republican monarchies. And it all kind of begins at the Battle of Agincourt, which was a deciding and determining battle in the war. Now, a big part of why the French lost this war is because they had crossbows, right? They were very well known for their crossbows, which could shoot people at intense speeds. Crossbows had more thrust behind them, and that being the case, they could pierce through armor more readily. But as we noted, it wasn't really about knights anymore. It wasn't about armor, right? It was about just throwing tons and tons of assholes at people. And that's what you see happen here, that the English just throw a lot of people at the French. But what they also do is they implement their own longbows, which take much less time to load, and which are far more devastating because you can put out more arrows. And if each side is developing a mercenary soldier base and a foot soldier base, you want to take out as many people as possible. You're not trying to take out big knights that are in fancy suits anymore. That's not really the name of the game. But this was a crushing defeat, and it really led us to a very powerful controversial, infamous, and pretty fascinating character, Joan of Arc, Jeanette as she was known. Uh, a woman who was not from a powerful aristocratic family, although there is some great kind of conspiracy theories about that. And really, Joan of Arc was an interesting figure and is so infamous for a very good reason. I mean, she was a strange character. She was a woman, as we noted, who was not of noble family line, but she promoted a very nationalistic, almost a proto-nationalistic sense of what it means to be French. And indeed, she identified the Dauphin. The Dauphin was like many of the rulers that we've been talking about in these two chapters. He came into his rulership rather young, and thus he wasn't yet able to attain his kingship status, but he was on the way to doing that. But because there was so many spy systems, because of these mercenary soldiers, the problem with mercenary soldiers is that it's very easy for a mercenary soldier to infiltrate the enemy camp and take out their leadership. So we had multiple false dauphins, right? And we have this young girl who gets a vision from God. And this vision of God tells her to put on a chivalric suit of armor, to dress as a man, and to go off in war to fight for her Dauphin, for God and for country. This is a very unique message, but she's able to successfully identify the Dauphin out of a group of people who could have been the Dauphin. And people see that as a sign from God, and it's easy to see why people would see this in the world. This is the world of the Black Death. This is the world of the 100 Years' War. It was very brutal. It was a very bloody time. And so charismatic people had a little bit more cachet, as they always do in times of crisis. And it's interesting how her charisma is really just exemplified in the fact that she was able to be so successful for so long, despite the fact that she was a woman cross-dressing and fighting as a pretty deft statistician and warrior in the 100 Years' War. Sadly, when France's fortunes begin to favor the Dauphin again, and when France starts to achieve victory, this young woman who had been so essential after the Battle of Agincourt is going to become pretty gosh darn reviled for all the reasons we just discussed. She's a cross-dressing poor girl with visions from God. And so when the English basically send off, once again, mercenaries to infiltrate and capture Joan of Arc and put her on trial for witchcraft, the French don't really step in. They kind of leave her to twist in the wind. And in fact, she is tried as a heretic and as a witch, and she is burned at the stake by the French. And this is a sad end to a very interesting life and story, and I would definitely recommend in the further readings chapter, if you're into Joan of Arc, to check out In Her Own Words, which talks about, it's a really interesting book that it has lots and lots of primary sources from her court trials, from her letters, from various correspondence, etc. And then the author makes some interesting kind of sidebars and commentaries to kind of contextualize it, but really lets you as the reader make the determination of what you think about this woman according to the words that you see written down, because she was really quite deft at speaking publicly, despite the fact that she didn't really receive a great education. Despite the fact that she wasn't noble, she was still able to command a lot of authority for a good long while. And I would definitely recommend, if you're into this, check out that source so you can see this story unfold. But even though the English were able to secure the victory in Agincourt, they fell to the French. And even with the French victory, the French, like many people in Europe, were suffering. They were suffering under the weight of a war that had been devastating. They were suffering under the weight of a famine and a little ice age. And when we get into the next part of this lecture, we'll talk about the Black Death and the ways that that influenced the world. So we can see in this final in the second to last panel for Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, this kind of horrible world, the world of popes in hell, of great schism, of the Babylonian captivity, of the Black Death, and of perpetual warfare that leads to, in turn, lots of civil warfare. We saw already the Italians warring in a civil war, and we're going to see that the English soon will begin their own civil war, the War of the Roses. And these are all going to be disastrous phenomenons for everyday life for people all over Europe. And we see this expressed more specifically in the peasant revolt movements of the 13th and 14th centuries primarily. One thing peasants were able to use was propaganda campaigns. This propaganda, I mean, even the fact that we have these visual sources showing these events are is in and of itself pretty exciting, because we have this new kind of paper culture. But we also see that with the peasant revolts, the way that peasants felt that the world had failed them. Their religious leaders had failed them. Their secular leaders had failed them. And even when they bastioned the campaigns of a young poor girl, she herself would be put to the fire. It's a dire world to live in. And we can see that the discontent and the strife that created reflected in these revolts that raged throughout Europe, especially in those places hit the hardest by the 100 Years' War and the Black Death. Now let's go ahead, and this is some further reading, especially with Jean Froissart, with the primary source, who talks about this idea of modern warfare, right? And that's a Joan of Arc book in her own words that I talked about. I would also say that the Avignon Papacy as an article is an excellent article kind of describing the events leading up to and during the Avignon Papacy.